The doors of the great hall burst open before Illyra could step aside, and the king of Vorin stormed through like a coming storm, boots striking the marble so hard that the sound rolled up into the high ceilings. She flattened herself against the cold stone wall, clutching a stack of parchment to her chest, and watched him pass close enough that the heat coming off his skin brushed her arm. He did not look at her. Nobody ever looked at her. That was the one mercy of being invisible in a palace built on voices, songs, and declarations shouted across banquet halls. Illyra had none of that. She had lost her voice at the age of 7, when a fever burned through her small body for 11 days and left her throat scarred and silent forever. Since then, words came to her only through ink. She worked in the lowest room of the West Tower, 3 floors beneath the royal chambers, in a chamber crowded with shelves of old records and the smell of drying parchment. Her master, an aging scribe named Edmund, had taken her in, when she was barely 12, after her family gave her away, rather than feed a mouth that could not sing for its supper in the Omega markets. Edmund did not care that she could not speak. He cared that her hand was steady and her letters were straight, and in a kingdom where most Omegas were valued for the sweetness of their voice during a courtship bond, that made her strange, and stranger still, safe. Safe was a relative word. That morning, as she carried a bundle of tax scrolls up the servant stairs, she overheard 2 guards speaking in low, hurried voices near the kitchen archway. "The king lost the peace talks with Ashvale," one of them muttered. "Their envoy walked out an hour ago. Said Vorin cannot be trusted to keep its word. He'll have someone's head for this," the second guard answered. "You saw his face. I have never seen him this angry." Illyra kept walking, eyes down, feet quiet on the stone. She had learned long ago that the safest thing an unheard Omega could do was to appear even more unheard than she already was. But her mind, quick and restless behind her silence, turned the guard's words over and over as she climbed the stairs. Something about the peace talks did not sit right with her. She had spent the past 3 days copying trade ledgers for the treasury, numbers that Vincent, the king's treasurer, had asked her to finish quickly and quietly. And in those ledgers, buried beneath columns of grain shipments and silver measures, she had noticed something odd. A payment, small but strange, sent from the royal treasury to a merchant house in Ashvale 2 weeks before the peace envoy arrived. A payment with no explanation attached to it. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Numbers were numbers, and it was not her place to question a treasurer twice her age and 10 times her rank. But now, with the guard's words ringing in her ears, the coincidence felt heavier than it should. If the Ashvale envoy believed Vorin could not keep its word, and a strange payment had passed between the 2 kingdoms just before that judgment was made, then someone inside the palace walls had reason to want the peace talks to fail. Illyra reached the top of the stairs and slipped into the small alcove where she kept her own private desk, tucked behind a shelf where Edmund allowed her a candle and a stool for her personal work. She set down the tax scrolls and sat very still for a long moment, staring at nothing. The king of Vorin was Draven, a man she had glimpsed only a handful of times from a distance, always surrounded by guards, always moving as though the palace itself were too small to contain him. People said he had taken the throne young, after his father died suddenly, and that he ruled alone because he trusted almost no one enough to take a mate. People also said he had a temper that could shake the stones of the palace when provoked, though Illyra had never seen it herself. She had only ever seen him as a shape moving through corridors far above her station, a king who did not know her name because she had never been given the chance to speak it. And yet, sitting there in the candlelight, she felt something rise in her chest that she rarely allowed herself to feel. It was not fear. It was something closer to responsibility. She had information that might matter, information that no guard or courtier had noticed, because they were too busy watching the king's anger, instead of the numbers hidden in his treasury's own books. She could not stand before him and explain it. She could not even whisper it to a passing servant, without risking that the wrong ears might hear first. And in a court full of ambition, the wrong ears were everywhere. But she could write. Illyra pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, dipped her quill, and paused only a moment before the ink began to flow. She wrote plainly, without her name, without any mark that could be traced back to a girl who worked 3 floors beneath the throne room. She described the payment she had seen in the treasury ledgers, the date it was made, the merchant house in Ashvale that received it, and the fact that it came only days before the envoy arrived, with expectations that Vorin clearly did not meet. She did not accuse anyone. She only laid out what she had seen, and let the truth speak for itself, the way it always had to, through her hand instead of her mouth. When she finished, she folded the parchment carefully and sat with it in her lap for a long while, her heart beating fast enough that she could feel it in her throat. Everything in her told her this was foolish. She was a nameless scribe's helper, mute since childhood, with no protection, and no family to speak for her if this went wrong. If the king discovered who had written this, and did not like what he read, there would be no one standing between her and his anger. But she thought of the guards' hushed voices, of the way they said he would have someone's head, and she thought of how easily that someone could be an innocent servant, standing near the wrong door at the wrong time, simply because no one had the courage to point toward the truth. She thought of her own life, shaped entirely by other people's decisions, because she had never been given a voice to make her own. Writing this letter was the only kind of speaking she had left, and for once, she wanted to use it for something larger than copying another man's numbers. That night, after Edmund had gone to his quarters and the tower had fallen silent, Alira made her way up through the palace, using the servant passages she had learned as a girl, corridors so narrow and forgotten that most nobles did not know they existed. She had delivered scrolls to the royal study before, always in daylight, always under supervision, but never alone, and never after dark. Her heart pounded with every step, and more than once she stopped, pressed against the stone, certain she had heard footsteps behind her. Each time, there was nothing, only the sound of the palace settling into sleep, and the low whisper of wind moving through old halls. She reached the door of the king's private study, just past midnight. A thin line of candlelight glowed beneath it, which told her he was still awake, still working through whatever fury the failed peace talks had left in him. For a moment, she almost turned back. It would have been so easy to slip the letter beneath a different door, to leave it with a steward instead, to let someone else carry the risk. But stewards could be bribed, and messages passed through many hands could be read by the wrong ones, before they ever reached the king. If this information mattered, it needed to reach him directly, without a single hand between her ink and his eyes. She knelt at the door, listening. Inside, she could hear the faint scratch of a quill and the occasional creak of a chair as he shifted his weight. She slid the folded parchment beneath the door as quietly as she could manage, then rose and walked away, without waiting to see if he noticed. Her whole body trembled as she retraced her steps through the passages, and she did not feel safe again until she reached her small alcove and sat down hard on her stool, pressing her hand against her chest, as though she could slow her racing heart by force. She told herself it was done now. Whatever happened next was out of her hands. She had given the king the truth, and if he was even half the ruler people believed him to be, he would know what to do with it. She would go back to her ledgers in the morning, copy numbers, stay invisible, and never think of this again. But sleep did not come easily that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the thin line of candlelight beneath the study door, and imagined, foolishly, what expression might cross his face when he found a stranger's letter waiting for him on the floor of his own private room. She told herself it did not matter. He would never know her name. He would never know the shape of her hand, the sound of her breath, the fact that she could not speak at all. To him, if he thought of the letter at all by morning, it would be nothing more than an anonymous scrap of information, easily forgotten among the 100 other burdens a king carried each day. She could not have known, lying awake in the dark, that across the palace, in a study lit by a single burning candle, Draven had already unfolded the parchment and was reading it for the third time, his anger from the failed peace talks slowly giving way to something sharper and far more dangerous to ignore. He turned the letter over in his hands, searching for a name, a seal, any mark that might tell him who had left it. There was nothing. Only careful, steady handwriting, and information too precise to be a rumor or a trick. He called for his captain of the guard, before the candle had burned another inch, his voice low and controlled in the way that unsettled people, far more than shouting, ever could. Someone inside his own palace had access to treasury records that should never have left Vincent's locked office, and someone had chosen, for reasons unknown, to bring it directly to him, rather than sell it to his enemies. That fact alone told him this was no ordinary spy. A spy would have taken the information to Ashvale, or to one of his rivals among the northern lords, and been paid handsomely for the trouble. Instead, it had come to him, quietly, at midnight, without a single demand attached to it. He did not sleep that night either. He sat with the letter long after his captain had gone to begin a quiet search of the household staff, turning the mystery over in his mind the way he might turn a blade, testing its edges, searching for a weakness. Whoever had written this letter knew the palace well enough to move unseen through it after dark. They knew the treasury's records well enough to catch an error that trained officials had missed, and they had chosen honesty over profit, which, in Draven's experience, was rarer in his court than any treasure Vincent kept locked away. By morning, word had already begun to spread quietly among the senior staff that the king was searching for someone, though no one knew exactly who or why. Elira heard the whispers as she carried scrolls through the corridors, servants murmuring about guards asking strange questions near the treasury offices, about the king demanding a full accounting of who had access to certain ledgers in the past month. She kept her face calm and her steps steady, though her stomach twisted with every word she overheard. She told herself there was no way anyone could trace the letter back to her. She had left no name, no seal, nothing but ink and honesty. She did not yet understand that honesty, in the hands of a king desperate for someone he could trust, was sometimes far more dangerous to hide than any lie could ever be. The accusation came before the sun had fully risen, sharp voices echoing through the servants' courtyard, where the staff gathered each morning to receive their duties. Elira stood near the well with her water jug, waiting her turn, when she saw Rosalind, a young laundry maid she had known since childhood, dragged forward by two guards, while the head steward shouted about a missing silver bracelet from the Duchess of Marrow's chambers. Rosalind was weeping, insisting she had never touched the Duchess's jewelry, but her protests meant little against the word of a noblewoman and the silver already found, mysteriously, tucked inside the lining of her cloak. Elira knew, without any doubt at all, that Rosalind was innocent. She had been with her the night before, helping fold linens in the laundry room until well past dark, long after the Duchess claimed her bracelet had gone missing from an unlocked chamber. But knowing the truth and being able to say it were two very different things, and Elira's throat closed around words that would never come, no matter how badly she wanted them to. She watched, helpless, as Rosalind was led away toward the lower cells to await judgment, her sobs fading down the corridor, while the other servants returned to their duties as though nothing unusual had happened at all. It was not unusual, not really. Servants were blamed for the convenience of nobles more often than anyone liked to admit, and an Omega, with no family and no rank, had little chance of being believed over a duchess's word. Elira spent the rest of the morning in a daze, copying scrolls with hands that trembled slightly, her mind circling back again and again to Rosalind's frightened face and the unfairness of a world that would rather punish the powerless than question the powerful. By midday, she had made up her mind. She could not speak for Rosalind in the halls of judgment, could not stand before the court and argue her friend's innocence the way a voice was meant to. But she had watched Rosalind fold linens the night before with her own eyes, and she remembered something else too, something she had noticed without thinking much of it at the time. One of the Duchess's own attendants, a sharp-eyed woman named Beatrice, who often visited the palace on her mistress's behalf, had been seen near the laundry room that same evening, lingering far longer than her errand required. Elira had learned, over years of watching from the edges of rooms where no one thought to guard their words around a mute servant, that people who wished to hide something rarely thought to hide it from her. She had seen Beatrice slip something small into her sleeve near the laundry baskets, though at the time she had assumed it was simply a personal item, nothing worth remembering. Now, with Rosalind locked away for a crime she could not have committed, that small memory felt suddenly enormous. She wrote her second letter that afternoon, hands steadier this time than they had been the first, though her heart still pounded with the same fear of discovery. She described what she had seen, careful again to leave no name of her own, no mark that could trace the words back to the girl who wrote them. She explained the timing of the laundry work, the fact that Rosalind could not have been in the Duchess's chambers at the hour the bracelet went missing, and the memory of Beatrice near the laundry baskets on the very night in question. She did not accuse Beatrice outright. She only laid the facts beside each other and trusted, as she had trusted before, that truth arranged plainly was more powerful than any accusation shouted aloud. That night, she made the same careful journey through the narrow servant passages toward the king's study, moving with more confidence this time, though no less caution. She had learned from her first letter that the king worked late, and she used that knowledge now, timing her steps so that she would not be seen by the guards who patrolled the main corridors on their rounds. When she reached the study door, She found it unlocked, just as it had been before, the candlelight glowing faintly beneath it. She almost knocked. The thought crossed her mind, and left just as quickly, because knocking meant standing before him, and standing before him meant he would see a mute servant girl, with nothing to offer but silence where words should be. It was easier, safer, kinder to herself, to slide the letter beneath the door and disappear the way she always did. Draven found the second letter an hour later, recognizing the same careful handwriting immediately, and something in his chest tightened with an interest he did not entirely understand. He read it twice, then a third time, weighing every detail against what he already knew of the household's routines. He had, in fact, heard of the missing bracelet and the laundry-maid's arrest that morning, though he had given it little thought amid the larger troubles of his kingdom. Servants were disciplined by household stewards more often than they ever reached his attention, and he trusted his staff to handle such matters fairly. But this letter suggested otherwise, and more than that, it suggested a pattern. Twice now, an anonymous hand had brought him information that others had either missed or chosen not to see, information that pointed not toward chaos, but toward quiet corrections his own court desperately needed. He thought of his captain, Cedric, a broad-shouldered man he had trusted since childhood, and decided the matter deserved a closer look before any punishment was carried out. The following morning, Draven ordered a quiet investigation into the laundry-maid's case, instructing Cedric to speak with the staff who had worked alongside her the previous evening, rather than simply accepting the Duchess's account. It did not take long for the truth to emerge. Several servants confirmed that Rosalind had been folding linens with them well past the hour the bracelet supposedly went missing, and one nervous young page admitted, under gentle but firm questioning, that he had seen Beatrice near the laundry room far longer than her errand should have required. When confronted, Beatrice's composure cracked quickly. She confessed, with tears that seemed more practiced than sincere, that she had taken the bracelet herself and hidden it among the laundry to cover a debt she owed a merchant in the lower city, planting it in Rosalind's cloak when she realized her theft might be discovered. The Duchess, embarrassed by her attendant's dishonesty, quietly withdrew her accusation against the laundry-maid, and Rosalind was released before nightfall, confused and grateful, with no understanding of who or what had saved her. Elira heard the news through the servants' quarters that evening, relief washing through her so completely that she had to sit down for a moment on the edge of her narrow bed. She had done it. Somehow, through nothing but ink and careful observation, she had reached across the vast distance between her silence and the king's power, and justice had followed. It felt like nothing she had ever experienced before, a strange, quiet triumph that no one around her would ever know she had earned. She did not know that in his private study, Draven sat with both letters spread before him on his desk, comparing the handwriting, the careful phrasing, the same steady confidence in laying out facts, without ever raising an accusing voice. He found himself thinking about the letters far more than the matters they described, wondering what kind of person moved through his palace unseen, gathering truths that others overlooked, and choosing, again and again, to bring them to him, rather than sell them elsewhere, or stay silent out of fear. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to look forward to the possibility of a third letter. Word of the laundry-maid's rescue spread quickly among the staff, though only in whispers, since no one wanted to draw the Duchess's anger by discussing her attendant's disgrace too openly. Rumors began to form about a hidden hand working somewhere in the palace, a friend to servants who had no other friends, though most dismissed it as nothing more than a lucky coincidence of timing. Elira listened to these rumors with a strange, private satisfaction, careful never to let her expression change, never to let anyone suspect that the quiet scribe's girl in the West Tower had anything to do with the mystery everyone found so curious. Edmund noticed something different in her that week, though he could not have said exactly what. She worked with the same steady focus she always had, copying scrolls and organizing records without complaint. But there was a new light in her eyes sometimes, a quiet alertness that had not been there before. He assumed it was simply the passing of time, the slow settling of a girl growing more confident in her skills, and thought nothing more of it. He had no reason to imagine that his quiet apprentice was carrying secrets far heavier than any scroll in his archive. Meanwhile, in the upper halls of the palace, Draven found himself distracted during council meetings, in a way that unsettled even him. He caught himself glancing toward the door of his study, during long, tedious discussions of grain taxes and border patrols, wondering if another letter might be waiting for him when the meeting ended. He told himself this fascination was purely practical, the natural interest of a ruler in an informant whose information had proven twice to be accurate and valuable. But late at night, alone with the candle burning low, he found himself rereading the earlier letters, not for their information, but for the careful, patient tone in which they were written. A tone that felt, strangely, like the voice of someone who had learned to be honest, because dishonesty had never served her well. He began leaving his study door unlocked deliberately now, a small test he did not fully admit even to himself, hoping that whoever moved through his palace in the dark might come again, and that this time, perhaps, he might catch more than just a folded letter on his floor. 3 more letters arrived over the following weeks. Each one slipped beneath the study door after midnight, each one addressing a different trouble that had escaped everyone else's notice. The first exposed a shipment of grain, quietly diverted from the northern villages, to line the pockets of a minor lord, who had claimed a poor harvest, to justify raising taxes on his own people. The second revealed that a foreign merchant seeking trade privileges had bribed a junior official to falsify records of his goods, hiding weapons among crates marked as cloth. The third, and perhaps the most unsettling, warned that a proposal being prepared for the king's signature contained a clause quietly altered from the version discussed in council, one that would have given away mining rights along the eastern border to a rival kingdom without anyone noticing until it was too late. Each time, Draven acted on the information, and each time, the letters proved true down to the smallest detail. He began to trust this unknown voice more than he trusted many of the advisors who sat at his own council table, a fact that troubled him during his quieter hours, though he could not deny it. Whoever wrote these letters saw his kingdom clearly, without the flattery or self-interest that colored so much of what reached his ears through official channels. They saw the cracks others were too comfortable, or too complicit to notice. He ordered his captain, Cedric, to intensify the search for the letter writer, though quietly, without alarming the household or driving the source into hiding. Cedric interviewed staff members under the guise of routine palace security checks, asking careful questions about who moved through the upper corridors at night, who had access to treasury records, trade documents, and council proposals. The answers led nowhere definite. Too many people, in truth, had some access to some piece of the puzzle, and no single name emerged as an obvious suspect. It was during one of these late investigations that Draven, restless and unable to sleep, decided to return to his study earlier than usual one evening, hoping to catch whoever left the letters in the act, rather than waiting until morning to find them already delivered. He moved through the corridor quietly, dismissing his usual guards from the immediate approach to his study, so as not to frighten away whoever might be waiting. The hallway was dim, lit only by a few torches, spaced far apart along the stone walls, and his footsteps made almost no sound on the thick carpet runner beneath his boots. As he rounded the final corner toward his study door, he caught the faintest scent in the air, something soft and unfamiliar, distinctly Omega, close enough that whoever carried it must have passed through only moments before. He stopped, every instinct sharpening at once, and scanned the shadows along the corridor. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a shape near the alcove where a tapestry hung loosely against the wall, a shift of darkness that might have been nothing more than a trick of torchlight. Illyra had heard his footsteps almost too late, the sound of his approach masked by the thick carpet, until he was nearly upon her. She had just slipped the 4th letter beneath the door and turned to retreat the way she always did, and now she found herself trapped between the study and the open corridor with nowhere to hide, except the narrow alcove behind the tapestry, a space barely wide enough to conceal her slight frame. She pressed herself against the cold stone, holding her breath, praying the fabric would not shift and betray her position. Draven took a step closer to the alcove, drawn by the scent that lingered unmistakably in the air, sweet and warm, and entirely out of place, in a corridor that should have held nothing but stone and dust at this late hour. His hand moved instinctively toward the tapestry, close enough now that Illyra could hear the soft rustle of his cloak, could feel the warmth radiating from him even through the fabric that separated them. Her heart pounded so violently, she feared he might hear it, and she pressed her palm flat against her own chest, as though she could physically silence it. A sudden sound echoed from further down the corridor, a guard's boots striking stone as he made his rounds, calling out a greeting to another patrol somewhere beyond the turn. Draven's attention flickered toward the sound for only a moment, but it was enough. Illyra seized the fraction of a second his focus wavered and slipped from behind the tapestry, moving low and swift toward the servant passage hidden behind a shelf of old banners at the far end of the hall, vanishing into the narrow stairwell before he turned back. By the time Draven reached the alcove and pulled the tapestry aside, there was nothing there but empty stone and the fading warmth of a presence that had already gone. He stood for a long moment, breathing in the last traces of that scent. Frustration and fascination tangled together in his chest in equal measure. He had come so close, close enough to have reached out and touched whoever it was, and yet they had slipped away like smoke through his fingers. But he had learned something important, something that changed everything he thought he understood about his mysterious correspondent. Whoever wrote these letters was not merely a clever servant with sharp eyes and a careful hand. They were an Omega, close enough to his own quarters at this late hour to have been standing nearly at his study door only moments before he arrived. That single fact narrowed the possibilities considerably, and yet somehow, it also deepened the mystery, because Draven found himself unable to stop thinking about the softness of that scent, long after the corridor had returned to silence. He returned to his desk and picked up the letter she had left, reading it slowly this time, aware in a way he had not been before that these careful, patient words had come from someone close, someone who moved through his own household in ways he had never noticed. He began to wonder, for the first time, whether he had passed her in a corridor without knowing it, whether he had seen her face among the dozens of servants who crossed his path each day without ever recognizing the mind and courage hidden behind it. The following morning, he summoned Cedric before the first council session began, and gave a new instruction, quieter and more specific than before. He wanted a list, discreet and thorough, of every Omega in the household staff, who might plausibly have reason to move through the upper corridors after midnight, along with any pattern of absence or unusual behavior noted by their supervisors. Cedric, though puzzled by the sudden intensity of his king's interest in a matter of household staffing, agreed to see it done without asking questions he suspected would not be welcomed. Illyra, unaware of how close she had come to discovery, spent the following days in a state of quiet anxiety, jumping at every unexpected sound, watching the corridors more carefully than ever before she dared to move through them. She told herself she would stop, that the risk had grown too great, that she had already done enough good with her letters and did not need to press her luck further. But when she overheard, only 2 days later, a hushed conversation between two council clerks about a proposal that would strip fishing rights from coastal villages to benefit a wealthy trading house with ties to a powerful lord, she found she could not stay silent, even in the only way she knew how to speak. She wrote the letter with trembling hands, aware now that the king himself might be waiting on the other side of that door, might have heard her breathing in the dark only nights before. But the villagers who would lose their livelihoods to a lord's greed had no one else to speak for them, and Illyra had learned, over the past weeks, that her silence did not have to mean her absence from the fight for what was right. She simply had to be more careful than she had ever been before. That night, she chose a different hour to make her journey, earlier than midnight, hoping to avoid whatever schedule Draven had begun to keep in his search for her. She moved through the passages with painstaking slowness, listening at every turn, and reached the study door to find it, as always, unlocked and glowing faintly with candlelight from within. She knelt to slide the letter beneath it, and for the briefest moment, she allowed herself to wonder what he looked like up close, whether his face carried the same fierce intensity people whispered about, or something softer that only showed itself in the privacy of an empty room. She did not linger to find out. She placed the letter and withdrew, disappearing into the shadows before the candle inside could so much as flicker with the draft from the door. But somewhere behind her, unseen in that moment, Draven had already begun to suspect that his mysterious informant might be closer to him, in ways both physical and otherwise, than either of them yet understood. Cedric's list of names took nearly a week to compile, and when it finally reached Draven's desk, it held far more names than he had expected. The palace employed dozens of Omegas across its many departments, from the kitchens to the laundries to the tower archives, and narrowing the search proved harder than either man had anticipated. Draven read through the list twice, searching for anything that might set one name apart from the rest, but nothing leaped out at him. No pattern of suspicious absence, no history of trouble, nothing that marked any single person as the author of letters that had already reshaped 3 important decisions in his kingdom. He found himself, against his own better judgment, paying closer attention to the Omegas he passed in the corridors over the following days, studying faces he had never bothered to notice before, wondering if the sharp intelligence behind the letters might show itself in a glance or a posture. He watched the kitchen staff during a brief visit to inspect the pantry stores, observed the laundry workers from a distance during his rounds through the lower courtyard, and even lingered near the tower archives on the pretense of requesting an old land survey, though the true purpose of his visit was something closer to curiosity than governance. He passed Alira twice that week without recognizing what stood before him. The first time, she was carrying a stack of scrolls up the servant stairs, her eyes lowered as they always were, her steps quiet and unremarkable. Draven glanced at her only briefly, noting nothing more than a slight, silent servant girl who moved out of his way with the same practiced invisibility as every other Omega who had learned to survive in a palace that valued voices above all else. The second time, he saw her through the open door of the tower archive, bent over a desk with quill in hand, so absorbed in her copying that she did not notice him passing at all. He remembered thinking, briefly, that Edmund's assistant seemed unusually diligent for someone so young, before his attention moved elsewhere, drawn by more pressing matters waiting in the council chamber. It did not occur to him that the mute scribe's girl could possibly be capable of the letters that had occupied so much of his private thoughts. In his mind, the letter writer was someone bold enough to move unseen through his palace at midnight, someone clever enough to catch errors that trained officials had missed, someone with a kind of quiet fire that surely could not belong to a girl who, by every account he had heard, never made a sound at all. It was, he would later realize, exactly the kind of assumption that had allowed Alira to remain invisible her entire life, the belief that silence meant emptiness, that a person without a voice must also be without a mind worth noticing. Alira, for her part, grew more cautious rather than less. She noticed the king's presence in unusual places that week, noticed him lingering near the archive door longer than any land survey should require, and understood, with a chill of fear, that her near escape in the corridor had set something in motion. She began varying her routes through the palace, timing her movements around the guards' patrol schedules with even greater care, and considered, more than once, whether she should stop writing the letters altogether until the search for her cooled. But something had shifted in her since that first letter about the payment to Ashvale, something she could not easily set aside, even when caution demanded it. For years, she had lived as a shadow in her own life, present but unseen, capable but unheard, valued only for the steadiness of her hand, and never for the thoughts that guided it. The letters had given her something she had never possessed before, not power exactly, but a kind of quiet agency, a way of shaping the world around her even when that world refused to acknowledge she existed. She was not ready to give that up simply because the search for her had grown more determined. It was during this uneasy stretch of caution and longing that she began to notice something new in the king's replies, or rather, in the absence of any punishment following her letters. Word reached the tower archive, as it always eventually did, that the king had quietly begun investigating each matter she raised, rather than dismissing them or hunting down the messenger with any real anger. She realized, slowly, that whoever received her letters was not simply using the information and discarding the source. He was thinking about her, wondering about her, in a way that felt, strangely, less threatening than she might have expected. One evening, unable to resist the pull of curiosity that had grown steadily since her narrow escape in the corridor, Alira lingered near the study door longer than necessary after delivering her latest letter about the coastal fishing rights. She heard, through the thick wood, the faint sound of Draven's voice, low and thoughtful, speaking to no one she could identify, perhaps simply thinking aloud, the way people sometimes did when they believed themselves entirely alone. "Whoever you are," she heard him say, his voice carrying just enough through the door for her to catch the words, "you see this kingdom more clearly than half the men who sit at my council table." Alira stood frozen in the corridor, her hand pressed against the cold wood of the door, her heart aching with a feeling she could not quite name. No one had ever spoken of her that way, not even in her own private thoughts about herself. She had always measured her worth by what she could not do, by the voice she did not have, by the courtship songs she could never sing, and the presentations she could never make at the gatherings where Omegas were meant to prove themselves worthy of an Alpha's attention. To hear the King of Voron speak of her letters, of her mind, with something close to admiration, undid a knot in her chest that she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. She left before he could open the door and find her standing there, but she carried his words with her back through the passages, turning them over and over in her mind like a treasure she did not quite believe she was allowed to keep. That night, for the first time since she began writing her letters, she found herself thinking not just about the injustices she wanted to correct, but about the man on the other side of that door, and what it might feel like to be truly known by him, rather than simply heard through ink and shadow. Her chance came sooner than she expected, though not in the way she might have imagined. 2 nights later, as she made her way toward the study with a letter warning of a merchant's plot to smuggle contraband weapons through the southern port, disguised as agricultural tools, she found the door slightly ajar, candlelight spilling out into the corridor, in a way it never had before. She hesitated, uncertain whether this was an invitation or a trap, whether Draven had left it open deliberately, hoping to catch her, or simply forgotten to close it in his exhaustion. Every instinct screamed at her to slide the letter beneath a nearby door instead, to wait for another night when the study was properly sealed and the risk of discovery lower. But something in her, some small, reckless part that had grown bolder with every letter she had successfully delivered, drew her closer instead. She approached the gap in the door and peered through, careful to keep herself hidden in the shadow of the corridor. Draven sat at his desk, head bowed over a stack of papers, one hand pressed against his temple in a posture of pure exhaustion. He looked, in that unguarded moment, nothing like the fierce commanding king the palace whispered about. He looked tired, burdened, and entirely alone, surrounded by the weight of a kingdom that demanded everything from him and gave little comfort in return. Elira felt something shift in her chest as she watched him, a tenderness she had not expected to feel for a man she had never properly met, a man whose anger she had feared enough to hide from in a corridor alcove only weeks before. She slid the letter beneath the door as quietly as she always did, but this time, before she withdrew, she paused for one long moment, watching him through the narrow gap, memorizing the shape of his exhaustion, the human weight of a crown that everyone else only saw from a respectful distance. Then she disappeared into the shadows, leaving him unaware that for the first time, someone had seen him not as a king, but simply as a man who carried too much and shared it with no one. Draven found the letter minutes later, and beneath the careful information about the smuggling plot, he discovered something new, folded into the same parchment, a short line added at the very end that had never appeared in any letter before. It read simply, in the same steady hand he had come to recognize instantly, "You do not carry this kingdom alone, even when it feels that way." He read the line perhaps a dozen times that night, and something in him, some guarded, careful part of himself that had learned long ago to trust almost no one, began, slowly and against his own caution, to soften. From that night forward, something between them changed, though neither could have named the exact moment it happened. Draven began leaving replies of his own, short notes tucked beneath a loose stone near the study door where he guessed, correctly, that his mysterious correspondent would look before delivering her next letter. He addressed them simply to the one who sees what I cannot, unwilling to guess at a name he did not know, and unwilling, too, to make any assumption that might frighten away the only honest voice he had found within his own walls. Elira discovered the first reply almost by accident, her fingers brushing against folded parchment, tucked into a crevice she had never noticed before, and she stood in the dim corridor reading his words, with a disbelief that slowly melted into quiet joy. He had written of his loneliness, admitting in careful, guarded language that ruling a kingdom alone left little room for trust, that every advisor at his table seemed to want something from him, whether influence, wealth, or simply the appearance of favor, and that he had grown so accustomed to that hunger in the eyes of everyone around him that he had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to without expectation of gain. She read his words again in the privacy of her small alcove, tracing the shape of his handwriting the way she imagined he might trace hers, and felt something crack open inside her chest that she had kept carefully closed for years. She had spent her whole life believing that her silence made her small, made her someone to be overlooked and underestimated, and yet here was a king, powerful beyond anything she could imagine, admitting his own smallness to a stranger he had never met, trusting her with a vulnerability he clearly showed no one else. She wrote back that same night, her reply longer than any letter she had sent before, filled not with warnings of corruption or hidden dangers, but with pieces of herself she had never shared with anyone beyond Edmund's quiet kindness. She wrote of growing up believing her silence made her less than whole, of learning to find her voice in ink because no other voice remained to her, of the strange, quiet courage it had taken to slide that very first letter beneath his door months ago, uncertain whether it would bring justice or ruin down upon her. She did not reveal her name, still too afraid of what discovery might mean. But she revealed enough of her heart that when Draven read it the following morning, he found himself moved in a way he had not expected any letter to move him. Their exchange continued for weeks in this quiet, careful rhythm. Letters passed back and forth through the loose stone near the study door, each one revealing a little more than the last. Draven wrote of his father, a cruel man who had ruled through fear and taught his son that softness was a weakness no king could afford, and of the guilt he carried for the ways he sometimes caught himself repeating those same hard lessons without meaning to. Elira wrote of Edmund's kindness, of the ache she still carried from a family who had given her away, rather than face the burden of a daughter who could not sing for her supper in the Omega markets, and of the strange, fragile hope she now carried, that perhaps silence did not have to mean invisibility after all. Neither of them spoke of these letters to anyone else. Draven told no one at his council table, no one among his guards, not even Cedric, though his captain noticed a change in his king's mood, a softness that had not been there before, and wondered privately what had caused it. Elira told no one either, not even Edmund, though the old scribe noticed too, in his own quiet way, that his young apprentice seemed to carry herself differently, with a light in her eyes that had not been there when she first came to him, as a frightened, silent child. It could not last forever, this careful secret, suspended between a king and a servant girl, neither one fully understood the other to be. Palaces did not keep secrets well, no matter how carefully they were guarded, and there were always eyes watching for weakness, always ambitious hands, ready to use whatever they found to their own advantage. Beatrice, disgraced after her theft of the Duchess's bracelet was exposed, had been dismissed from her position, but had not left the palace grounds entirely, working now in a lesser capacity within the kitchens, while she waited for an opportunity to restore her standing. She harbored a bitter resentment toward whoever had exposed her, though she had never learned it was Elira's letter that led to her downfall, and she watched the household with sharp, suspicious eyes, hungry for any advantage that might lift her back into favor. It was Beatrice who first noticed Elira's late-night absences from the servants' quarters, having taken to wandering the lower corridors herself in the hours after midnight, unable to sleep with the shame of her demotion weighing on her mind. She saw the mute scribe's girl slip from her narrow bed and disappear down the servant passages more than once, always at the same late hour, always returning sometime after, with a strange, careful quiet about her that Beatrice recognized instantly as the behavior of someone hiding something important. Beatrice did not know what Elira was hiding, but she suspected, correctly, that it might be valuable, and she began to watch more closely, following at a careful distance on nights when curiosity overcame her caution. She did not yet understand the full shape of what she was uncovering, but she recognized opportunity when she saw it, and she began, quietly, to gather what pieces of the puzzle she could, waiting for the right moment to use them. Meanwhile, Draven's letters to Elira grew warmer with each exchange, though he still knew nothing of her identity beyond the fact that she was an Omega who moved through his palace unseen. He began to wonder, with increasing frequency, whether he might ask her to reveal herself, whether the trust they had built through ink alone might survive the weight of a face and a name attached to it. He feared, in equal measure, that discovering her identity might shatter whatever fragile magic existed between them, that the woman behind the letters might feel like a stranger once he could see her clearly, or worse, that she might fear him too much to ever trust him the same way again, once she stood before him, without the protection of anonymity. He wrote to her one night, his hand hesitant in a way it rarely was, asking gently whether she might ever consider meeting him, not as king and subject, but simply as two people who had shared more honesty with each other through ink than either had shared with anyone else in years. He left the letter beneath the loose stone and waited, more nervous than he had felt in longer than he could remember, for whatever answer might come. Elira found the letter the following night, and read it standing in the dim corridor, her heart caught between hope and terror in equal measure. She wanted, more than she had wanted almost anything in her life, to say yes, to finally stand before the man whose words had come to mean so much to her, to let him see her face and know, at last, whose hand had written every letter he had come to trust. But she was also afraid, deeply afraid, that the moment he learned she could not speak, that she was nothing more than a mute scribe's assistant with no rank and no voice, The warmth in his letters might curdle into disappointment, or worse, into the same quiet dismissal she had spent her whole life learning to expect from everyone around her. She did not answer his question that night. She carried the letter back to her alcove and sat with it for a long time, torn between the courage that had carried her this far and the fear that had protected her for even longer, uncertain which one deserved to win. 3 days passed before Alira found the courage to answer him. 3 days in which she moved through her duties in the tower archive with a distracted mind that Edmund noticed but did not question, and 3 nights in which she stood before the loose stone near the study door with a fresh letter in hand, only to lose her nerve and slip away without leaving it. On the 4th night, she finally allowed herself to write the truth as plainly as she could manage, though she still could not bring herself to name the one detail that frightened her most. She wrote that she wished to meet him, that the thought of finally standing before him filled her with a hope she had not let herself feel in years, but that she needed him to understand something first, something that might change how he saw her entirely. She wrote that she could not speak, that a childhood illness had taken her voice long ago and left her with nothing but ink to carry her thoughts into the world, and that if this truth changed anything between them, she would rather know it now than discover it standing helpless before him, with no words to soften the blow. She left the letter beneath the loose stone with trembling hands and hurried away before she could change her mind, her heart pounding, with a fear sharper than any she had felt while dodging guards in dark corridors. She spent the following day in an agony of waiting, barely able to focus on her copying work, glancing toward the tower window every few minutes, as though the answer might arrive through the glass, instead of through the careful passages she had used for months. Draven read her confession that evening with a stillness that surprised even him. He had wondered, in his private moments, whether her silence in person might mean shyness, or perhaps caution, born of her low position within the household. But the truth she revealed was something else entirely, something that explained, all at once, the particular courage her letters had always carried. He thought of every word she had written to him, every careful observation, every quiet confession of her own fears and hopes, and understood now that all of it had come from someone who possessed no other way of reaching the world except through the patient movement of a quill across parchment. Far from changing how he saw her, the revelation deepened something in him that he had not expected. He thought of his own father, a man who had ruled through the loudest voice in any room, who had valued strength only when it announced itself with force, and he thought of how differently this woman had chosen to move through the world, quietly, patiently, finding power not in volume, but in truth, carefully placed where it could do the most good. He wrote back that same night, his reply gentler than any he had sent before, assuring her that her silence changed nothing about the respect he held for her mind and her courage, and that he would welcome the chance to meet her exactly as she was, with no expectation that she offer him anything more than the same honesty she had always given so freely. He proposed a place and time, a small garden courtyard behind the eastern wing, that few members of the household frequented after dark, private enough to offer them both some measure of safety from prying eyes, and asked only that she come whenever she felt ready, with no pressure to rush toward a moment she might still need time to prepare herself for. Alira read his reply with tears she had not expected, relief and gratitude tangled together so tightly she could barely breathe past the lump in her throat. She decided, sitting alone in her small alcove that night, that she would go to him within the week, once she had gathered enough courage to face whatever came next. But the days she spent preparing herself gave Beatrice exactly the time she needed to complete her own quiet investigation. Having followed Alira on 3 separate nights now, noting the careful route she took through the servant passages and the particular hour she always chose to move, Beatrice had begun to suspect, with growing certainty, that the mute scribe's girl was connected somehow to the mysterious letters that had reshaped so many decisions within the palace over the past months. She did not yet understand the full nature of the connection, imagining perhaps that Alira served as a messenger for someone else, some hidden conspirator using a voiceless servant as a convenient and unsuspicious courier. Determined to uncover proof that might restore her standing with the Duchess, and perhaps earn favor with other powerful figures within the court, Beatrice took to searching Alira's small alcove during the hours when she knew the scribe's girl would be occupied with her copying duties in the archive below. It did not take long to find what she was looking for. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth, Alira had kept every reply Draven had ever sent her, unable to bring herself to destroy words that had come to mean more to her than almost anything else in her life. Beatrice read through the letters with growing shock, recognizing immediately the significance of what she held in her hands. The king's own handwriting, addressed to an unnamed correspondent, filled with confessions of loneliness and admiration that no ruler would ever want made public. All of it connected somehow to the mute girl who worked 3 floors beneath the throne room copying tax scrolls and land surveys. Beatrice understood at once that this discovery was worth far more than any bracelet she had ever stolen, and she began, with cold calculation, to consider how best to use it. She could have taken the letters directly to the Duchess, trading the scandal for a return to favor, but something in her recognized a larger opportunity, a chance not merely to restore her own standing, but to destroy the reputation of the very servant she suspected had exposed her theft in the first place, though she still could not prove that connection with certainty. She decided instead to bring her discovery before the full court, timing the revelation for maximum effect, choosing to frame it not as an innocent connection between 2 lonely people, but as something far more sinister, a manipulation, a deception practiced upon an unsuspecting king by a scheming servant who had used secret correspondence to worm her way into his trust, and, perhaps, his affections. She spread the first whispers carefully among the nobles she still had access to, planting seeds of suspicion about strange goings-on within the palace, about a mysterious informant who had influenced several major decisions, about the king's unusual late nights spent alone in his study. She let the rumors grow before revealing anything definite, allowing curiosity and suspicion to build among the court until the moment felt right to strike with the full weight of her discovery. Elira, unaware of the storm gathering around her, spent that week in a fragile happiness she had rarely allowed herself to feel, imagining the coming meeting in the eastern courtyard with a hope so tender she hardly dared examine it too closely, for fear it might shatter. She had no way of knowing that the letters she treasured most, the private words that had finally let her feel seen and valued exactly as she was, had already fallen into hands determined to use them, not to celebrate what she and Draven had built together, but to destroy it entirely. The court gathered on a bright morning for what should have been an ordinary session of petitions and minor disputes, nobles and officials filling the great hall in their usual formations, while Draven sat upon his throne, his mind, as it had been for weeks, only partly on the matters before him. He was thinking of the coming evening, of the garden courtyard behind the eastern wing, of the letter he had received only the day before confirming that his mysterious correspondent would finally come to meet him after the sun set. Beatrice chose that morning to make her move, stepping forward from among the gathered attendants with a boldness that startled the nobles around her, who were unaccustomed to seeing a disgraced former attendant address the court directly. She carried with her a small bundle of parchment, and before any guard could stop her, she announced in a clear, carrying voice that she had uncovered proof of a servant girl deceiving the king through secret letters, manipulating his decisions and his trust for reasons known only to herself. The hall fell into stunned silence, every eye turning first to Beatrice, and then, in confusion, toward the throne where Draven sat frozen, his expression unreadable to everyone but perhaps Cedric, who stood near enough to see the color drain slightly from his king's face. Beatrice did not wait for permission to continue. She held up the letters, reading fragments aloud, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall, careful to choose the lines that sounded most damning when stripped of their context, the private confessions of loneliness and longing that Draven had shared, twisted now into evidence of a king bewitched by a scheming subordinate. She named Elira before the king could stop her, having confirmed the connection through careful comparison of handwriting samples she had gathered from the Tower archive, comparing scraps of Elira's copying work against the letters hidden beneath the floorboard. The name meant little to most of the nobles present, who had never heard of the quiet scribe's assistant working 3 floors beneath the throne room, but it meant everything to Draven, who felt the ground shift beneath him as the private world he had built through months of careful letters came crashing into the harsh light of public scrutiny. He rose from his throne, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd, with the authority of a man determined to regain control of a situation spiraling rapidly beyond his grasp. He commanded silence, and the hall obeyed instantly, though the whispers continued beneath the surface, spreading the scandal from mouth to mouth, even as he spoke. He did not deny the letters, could not deny them without lying before his entire court, but he refused to allow Beatrice to frame their meaning without challenge, insisting that nothing improper had passed between himself and whoever had written to him, that the letters contained information vital to the safety and prosperity of the kingdom, information that had exposed corruption, prevented injustice, and protected trade routes from smuggled weapons. But the damage had already begun to take root. Several of the older, more conservative lords exchanged glances heavy with disapproval, murmuring among themselves about the impropriety of a king exchanging private confessions with an unranked servant, about the danger of allowing a voiceless Omega with no family and no standing to gain such influence over matters of state through nothing more than clever manipulation of a lonely man's affections. Others, more pragmatic, seemed less concerned with propriety and more curious about the identity of someone who had apparently outmaneuvered the palace's own officials on multiple occasions without anyone noticing until now. Illyra learned of the scandal from a frightened kitchen maid who came running to the Tower archive not an hour after the court session ended, breathless with the news that the king's secret letters had been exposed before the entire nobility, and that the servant girl responsible had been named as none other than Edmund's quiet apprentice from the West Tower. Illyra felt the blood drain from her face as the maid spoke, her worst fear made suddenly, horribly real. Everything she had shared in those letters, every private hope and confession, every piece of herself she had finally found the courage to reveal, had been torn from its careful privacy and thrown before a court eager to judge her without ever hearing her side of things, a side she could not even speak aloud to defend herself. Edmund found her sitting frozen at her desk minutes later, her hands trembling too badly to hold her quill, and though he did not yet understand the full shape of what had happened, he recognized immediately that his young apprentice was in serious trouble. He asked her, gently, whether the rumors sweeping through the palace were true, and Illyra, unable to speak the answer, could only nod, tears finally spilling down her face as the weight of months of careful secrecy collapsed all at once into public exposure. Guards arrived at the Tower archive before the hour was out, sent by Cedric under orders that even he did not fully understand himself, tasked with bringing Illyra before the king to answer for the accusations Beatrice had leveled against her. Edmund tried to protest, insisting that his apprentice had done nothing but her copying duties faithfully for years, but the guards, though not unkind, made clear that the matter was beyond his authority to resolve, and that Illyra needed to come with them, regardless of what she could or could not say in her own defense. She walked through the palace corridors that afternoon with a fear unlike anything she had known before, aware of every eye that followed her, every whisper that trailed in her wake, as word spread ahead of her that the mute scribe's girl was the mysterious letter writer who had somehow bewitched the king himself. She thought, as she walked, of every letter she had written, every truth she had carefully laid out for a man she had come to trust more deeply than anyone else in her life, and wondered if all of it was about to be twisted beyond recognition, transformed from an act of quiet courage into a crime she had never intended to commit. The guards led her not to the great hall where the court still buzzed with scandal, but to a smaller private chamber near the king's own quarters, and Illyra understood, with a fresh wave of terror, that Draven himself intended to question her directly, away from the eyes of the court, before deciding what to do about the storm his own private letters had unleashed upon them both. The private chamber was small, compared to the grand halls she had only ever glimpsed from a distance, warmed by a fire crackling low in the hearth, and lit by afternoon sun slanting through a narrow window. Draven stood near that window when the guards brought her in, his back to the door, his shoulders held with a tension that told Illyra he had not yet decided how this meeting would end. When he turned to face her, she saw for the first time, up close, the man whose words had filled her nights with a comfort she had never known before, and found that he looked exactly as tired and human as he had appeared through the gap in his study door weeks ago, though now that exhaustion was tangled with something sharper, something that might have been anger, or might have been fear of a different kind entirely. He dismissed the guards with a single word, and when the door closed behind them, leaving the two of them alone for the first time since her letters had first begun, silence stretched between them so heavy, it felt almost physical. Illyra stood with her hands clasped tightly before her, unable to speak the apology or the explanation that crowded her throat, unable to do anything at all except meet his gaze and hope that he could read, in her eyes, some fraction of the honesty she had always poured into her letters. Draven held up the bundle of letters Beatrice had stolen, his hand not entirely steady, and asked, in a voice rougher than he intended, whether they were truly hers. It was not really a question. He already knew the answer, had known it from the moment Beatrice spoke the name Elira before the court, connecting it instantly to the quiet scribe's assistant he had glimpsed twice in passing, without ever recognizing what stood before him. But he needed to hear it confirmed, needed some acknowledgement between them that could not be twisted by a court eager for scandal. Elira could only nod, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall, and then, because nodding felt insufficient for everything she needed him to understand, she reached for the small writing case she carried always tucked into her apron, the same tools she had used to write every letter that had passed between them. Her hands shook as she pulled out a scrap of parchment and her quill, and she wrote quickly, her handwriting less careful than usual, betraying the tremor she could not fully control, telling him that every word in those letters had been true, that she had never meant to deceive him, that the confessions she shared had come from her own heart and nothing else, not manipulation, not calculation, only the truth she had never been able to speak aloud to anyone before him. Draven read her words in silence, and something in his rigid posture began, slowly, to ease. He looked up from the parchment and studied her face properly for the first time, searching for the deception the court had so quickly assumed must exist, and found instead only fear, and beneath the fear, the same quiet steadiness that had colored every letter she had ever written him. He thought suddenly of his own father, a man who had ruled through cruelty and taught his son that omegas without rank or voice were beneath serious consideration, fit only for labor and silence, never for trust or partnership. He remembered watching his father dismiss a young omega servant once, years ago, for daring to correct an error in the royal accounts, humiliating her, before the entire staff, simply for having the audacity to be right when a nobleman was wrong. He had been young then, and had said nothing, had let that lesson settle into him the way his father intended, teaching him that some voices simply did not matter, no matter how true their words might be. He realized now, standing before Elira with her trembling hand still holding the quill, that he had nearly repeated that same failure without ever meaning to, allowing his own court's assumptions about her silence and her low position to blind him to the extraordinary courage and clarity she had shown him for months. He had trusted her words completely when they arrived anonymously in the dark, had come to depend on her honesty more than the counsel of any noble at his table, and yet some part of him, until this very moment, had still carried his father's old poison, the unspoken belief that a voiceless servant girl could not possibly be equal to the trust he had already, unknowingly, placed in her. He set the letters down on the table between them and asked, more gently now, why she had never told him sooner who she was, why she had waited until his own question forced the confession from her. Elira wrote again, slower this time, explaining that she had spent her whole life being underestimated because of her silence, that she had feared, more than almost anything, that the moment he saw her clearly, a mute servant with no rank and no family, the warmth in his letters might curdle into disappointment or pity, the same way every other person in her life had eventually looked at her, once her silence became impossible to ignore. Draven crossed the room and knelt before her chair, an act so far beneath what any king was expected to do for a servant that Elira could hardly believe it was happening, and told her, plainly, that nothing about her silence had ever made her letters less true or her mind less brilliant, that he had come to trust her more than anyone else within his own walls, precisely because she had never once asked him for anything in return for her honesty. He told her that whatever the court believed, whatever ugly shape Beatrice had twisted their letters into, he did not regret a single word he had written to her, and he did not intend to let scandal or tradition dictate whether he continued to value the one voice in his kingdom that had never once lied to him. But even as he spoke these words, meaning every one of them, both of them understood that the court outside this small chamber would not be so easily convinced, and that whatever they had built together in careful secrecy now faced a battle neither of them could win through private conversation alone. By evening, the scandal had spread through every level of the palace, from the highest council chambers down to the kitchens where Beatrice herself now worked, and opinions divided sharply along lines that revealed far more about the court's fears than about Elira herself. Lord Nathaniel, a smooth-spoken nobleman who had long positioned himself as one of Draven's closest advisors, seized upon the scandal with an eagerness that Cedric found faintly suspicious, though he could not yet say why. Nathaniel argued before the gathered council the following morning That a king who allowed himself to be swayed by secret correspondence from an unranked, voiceless servant set a dangerous precedent, one that undermined the natural order that kept the kingdom stable, and he called, with practiced sorrow in his voice, for Alira to be quietly removed from the palace and sent far from the capital before her influence could do any further damage to the crown's authority. Several lords nodded along with Nathaniel's words, more troubled by the appearance of impropriety than by any of the good her letters had actually achieved, and Draven found himself facing a council more united against Alira than he had expected, their concerns wrapped in careful language about tradition and precedent that could not entirely hide the older, uglier prejudice underneath, the same belief his own father had once held, that an Omega without rank or voice had no place shaping the decisions of a kingdom. Draven listened to their arguments with a stillness that unsettled those who knew him well, and when Nathaniel finished speaking, he asked a single question that silenced the murmuring council entirely. He asked which decision, exactly, made through information Alira had provided, had harmed the kingdom in any way. He reminded them of the corrupt payment diverted from the northern villages, exposed and corrected because of her first letter. He reminded them of the smuggled weapons hidden among cloth shipments, caught before they ever reached the southern port because of her warning. He reminded them of the altered clause that would have handed away mining rights along the eastern border, discovered in time only because someone had cared enough to read the fine print that no one else had bothered to check. Nathaniel's composure flickered, just slightly, at the mention of the altered mining clause, a reaction so brief that only Cedric, watching closely from his position near the council table, happened to notice it. Cedric had grown suspicious of Nathaniel over the preceding weeks. Ever since his own investigation into the household staff had turned up an unusual detail he had not yet shared with Draven. A record showing that Nathaniel's private secretary had visited the treasury offices on the same day the mysterious payment to the Ashvale merchant house had been recorded, months before Alira's very first letter ever reached the king's desk. Draven declared before the council that he would not banish or punish a woman whose only crime had been telling him the truth, when everyone else around him had either missed it or chosen to stay silent, and he reminded the assembled lords, in a voice that carried the same hard authority his father had once used for crueler purposes, that a king who punished honesty to protect the comfort of tradition did not deserve to be trusted by anyone, servant or noble alike. He declared, further, that he intended to investigate the matter of the smuggled weapons and the altered mining clause more thoroughly, suspecting now that these were not simply crimes of convenient opportunity, but pieces of a larger scheme, orchestrated by someone with access to the treasury, the council, and the trade agreements alike. The council chamber fell into an uneasy silence at this declaration, and Nathaniel, sensing the ground shifting beneath his careful arguments, pressed harder for Alira's removal, warning that allowing her to remain within the palace would only invite further scandal and weaken the crown's standing among the other kingdoms, who already viewed Voron's recent troubles with growing suspicion. But Draven held firm, and when the council session ended without the ruling Nathaniel had hoped for, he instructed Cedric privately to expand his investigation into the treasury records surrounding both the smuggling attempt and the mining clause, this time looking specifically at who among the nobility might have had reason to want both schemes to succeed. That night, alone once more in his study, Draven wrote a final letter and left it beneath the loose stone, though this time he did not need to hide his identity, or hers, behind careful anonymity. He wrote to Alira directly, using her name for the first time in ink, telling her that he intended to fight for her place beside him, regardless of what the court believed was proper, and that he suspected the scandal Beatrice had unleashed against her was not simply born of petty jealousy, but might be connected to something far larger and more dangerous still hiding within his own council. Alira read his words that night with a fragile, cautious hope beginning to bloom again, beneath the fear that had consumed her since the scandal broke. She thought of Rosalind, rescued from a false accusation months ago because Alira had noticed what others overlooked, and she thought, suddenly, of a detail she had nearly forgotten in the chaos of the past 2 days. A memory of Nathaniel's secretary visiting the treasury offices around the same time she had first noticed the strange payment to Ashvale, a detail she had dismissed then as unimportant, but which now, in light of everything Draven suspected, felt like the missing piece that might finally expose the true architect of the kingdom's recent troubles. She wrote back immediately, her hand steady despite everything, sharing the memory she had nearly let slip away, and understood, as she folded the letter and prepared to deliver it one final time, that the coming days would decide not only her own fate within the palace, but whether the truth she had spent months defending through careful ink and quiet courage would finally be believed loudly enough to matter before the entire court. Cedric's investigation moved quickly once he had a clear direction to follow, and within 2 days, he had gathered enough evidence to bring before the king with confidence. Records from the treasury, cross-referenced with the trade documents Alira had once exposed regarding the smuggled weapons, showed a pattern of payments and signatures that led, again and again, back to Nathaniel's private secretary, a quiet, unremarkable man named Gregory, who had served the nobleman faithfully for over a decade, and had, until now, escaped anyone's suspicion entirely. Gregory had authorized the strange payment to the Ashvale merchant house, had falsified the shipping documents that hid weapons among bolts of cloth, and had altered the mining clause in the trade proposal, all under Nathaniel's direction, though always careful to keep his master's name off any document that might later be traced. Draven called for a full session of the court the following morning, gathering nobles, officials, and household staff alike in the Great Hall, determined to settle the matter publicly, rather than allow rumor and scandal to continue eroding trust in his rule. He summoned Alira as well, aware that she could not speak in her own defense, but determined that she would stand before the court this time, not as an accused deceiver, but as the very person whose careful observations had ultimately unraveled a conspiracy that threatened the stability of his entire kingdom. Rosalind, the young laundry maid Alira had saved from false imprisonment months before, stood among the gathered servants that morning, and when Cedric asked whether anyone present could speak to the character and honesty of the accused scribe's assistant, Rosalind stepped forward without hesitation, her voice trembling but clear, as she told the court of her own wrongful arrest, of the mercy that had freed her, though she had never known its source, until whispers finally connected the pieces in the days following the scandal's outbreak. She spoke of Alira's quiet kindness in the laundry room, of the steady friendship she had shown a girl with no rank to offer in return, and asked the court to consider that someone capable of such loyalty toward a friend was unlikely to be capable of the manipulation Beatrice had accused her of. Draven then presented the evidence Cedric had gathered, laying out Gregory's falsified documents and the payments traced back through Nathaniel's household, and called upon Alira herself to confirm the memory she had shared in her final letter, the detail of Nathaniel's secretary visiting the treasury offices in the days before the very first payment to Ashvale had been recorded. Alira stepped forward, and rather than write her testimony on a scrap of parchment as she always had, she used a larger sheet prepared in advance, holding it before the court so that everyone could see her steady hand, confirming what Draven had already begun to prove, her silence for once amplified rather than diminished by the simple courage of standing before hundreds of watching eyes and refusing to look away. Nathaniel, cornered by evidence he could no longer deny, attempted first to blame Gregory entirely, claiming ignorance of his secretary's actions, but Cedric produced a final piece of evidence that broke through even this last defense, a letter in Nathaniel's own hand, instructing Gregory to ensure that the Ashvale payment would be arranged quietly enough to guarantee the peace talks failed, a scheme designed to weaken Draven's standing among the neighboring kingdoms and position Nathaniel himself as the steady, reliable voice the court would turn to in a moment of crisis, perhaps even paving the way for his own influence to grow beyond anything a mere advisor should possess. The hall erupted into murmurs of shock and outrage as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, and Nathaniel, seeing no path left to talk his way free, finally admitted the truth, his careful, practiced calm cracking at last, under the weight of evidence too thorough to escape. He had orchestrated the failed peace talks, the smuggled weapons, and the altered mining clause all as pieces of a larger plan to destabilize Draven's rule, gradually enough that no single failure could be traced back to him, until the moment came when the court itself might beg him to take a firmer hand in governing the kingdom's affairs. Draven ordered Nathaniel and Gregory both taken into custody to await formal judgment, and as the guards led them from the hall, he turned to address the remaining council and nobles with a clarity that left no room for further doubt. He reminded them that every warning which had disrupted Nathaniel's careful scheme had come from Alira, a woman the court had been prepared to banish, only days before, for the crime of caring enough about her kingdom to speak the truth in the only way available to her. He declared, before the entire assembled court, that he intended to claim her as his mate, not despite her silence, but because of the extraordinary courage that silence had never managed to diminish, and he made clear that any lord who believed a voiceless Omega unworthy of standing beside her king had learned nothing from the very conspiracy that had just been exposed before their eyes. No one in the hall spoke against him. Whatever quiet prejudice had colored the council's earlier arguments could not survive the plain evidence of what Alira's courage had accomplished, evidence far louder than any voice raised in objection might have been. Beatrice, watching from among the kitchen staff with a bitterness she could no longer voice without risking further punishment, understood that her attempt to destroy the mute scribe's girl had instead elevated her beyond anything Beatrice herself could ever have imagined, and she said nothing more, retreating quietly into whatever future remained for her after such a costly gamble. That evening, once the court had finally emptied, and the palace had begun to settle into the quiet aftermath of a scandal-turned-triumph, Draven found Alira in the small garden courtyard behind the eastern wing, the very place he had once asked her to meet him before Beatrice's scheme interrupted their careful, private world. She stood among the flowering vines with the last light of sunset catching gently in her hair, and when he approached, she did not reach for a quill or a scrap of parchment. She simply looked at him, and in her eyes he read everything he needed to understand: gratitude, relief, and a love that had grown slowly and honestly through months of careful letters, until it had become something neither scandal nor tradition could ever hope to break. He took her hand gently, mindful of everything she had survived to reach this moment, and told her that he did not need her to speak in order to be heard, that he had learned, through months of ink and quiet courage, that some voices carried further precisely because they had learned to choose their words with such patient, deliberate care. Alira smiled, and though she still could not answer him aloud, she lifted his hand and pressed it gently against her heart, letting him feel the steady, certain rhythm of everything she could not say, but had always, somehow, found a way to make him understand. In the months that followed, the palace grew accustomed to a new sight that had never existed before within its ancient walls: a king who paused often in his corridors to read letters passed quietly between himself and the Omega who would soon become his queen. Their private correspondence, no longer a secret hidden beneath loose stones, but a cherished habit, openly cherished by both of them, a reminder that even in a kingdom built on voices and songs and loud declarations of worth, the truest words are sometimes the ones written slowly, honestly, and with a courage that speaks louder than any sound ever could. Edmund lived to see his quiet apprentice stand beside the throne she had once only glimpsed from a distant corridor, and Rosalind, freed from a false accusation months before, became one of the new queen's most trusted attendants, carrying messages between them with a loyalty that never wavered. And in a small frame above the mantel of their private chambers, protected and treasured, Draven kept the very first letter Alira had ever written him, a reminder, always, that the voice a kingdom needs most is not always the loudest one in the room, but the one brave enough to tell the truth, when everyone else has chosen silence for far lesser reasons.